Okay, I see everybody trickling in one by one. Hey everyone.
Hello.
It's so good to see so many familiar smiley faces. Hi Hedy. Hi everybody.
Hi, Prophetess.
Hi.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I let everybody in who is in the waiting room right now. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Good morning if you're on the other side of the planet. Good afternoon if you're somewhere nearby, but not that close. I'm very happy to be hosting Dr. Omar Sabbagh today, and who will be giving us a very, very interesting session on some of his latest works. And Dr. Sabbagh will tell you more about this in a bit. Just allow me to introduce him to you. For those of you who do not know Dr. Omar Sabbagh, he is a widely published poet, writer, and critic. His first collection and his fourth collection are, respectively, My Only Ever Edible Complaint and To the Middle of Love. His fifth collection, but it was an important failure, that's the title of the collection, was published with Cinnamon Press at the start of 2020. His Beirut novella, Via Negativa, A Parable of Exile, was published with Licorice Fish Books in March 2016. And he has published much short fiction, some of it prize-winning. A study of the oeuvre of Professor Fiona Sampson, called Reading Fiona Sampson, A Study in Contemporary Poetry and Poetics, was published with Anthem Press in July 2020. His Dubai novella, Minutes from the Miracle City, was published with Fairlight Books in July 2019. He has published scholarly essays on George Eliot, Ford Madox Ford, G.K. Chesterton, Henry Miller, Lawrence Stirl, Joseph Conrad, Lytton Strachey, T.S. Eliot, Basil Bunting, Hilaire Belloc, George Steiner, and others, as well as on many contemporary poets. Many of these works are collated in To My Mind or Kinboats, Essays on Literature, published with Whiskey Tit in January 2021. Morning Lit, Portals After Alia, is a book of poetry and prose forthcoming with Cinnamon Press in early 2022. Dr. Sabbagh holds a BA in PPE from Oxford, 3 MAs, all from the University of London, in English literature, creative and life writing, and philosophy. Dr. Sabbagh also has a PhD in English literature from King's College London. He was visiting assistant professor of English and creative writing at the American University of Beirut from 2011 to 2013. Presently, he teaches at the American University in Dubai, where he is associate professor of English. So,
Okay.
Dr. Sabbagh, without further ado.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'm looking forward to this. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I begin. I mean, I wrote this paper about a month ago, and it is very much, I suppose, a paper, a lecture / paper. I'm going to put it up on the screen as I read from it, if that's okay with everyone, because I think it just makes it a bit more engaging, especially if you come to a block quote, let's say, you can all read it as a quote without me having to say quote, end quote, and things like that. I also wanted to say it's a paper which is quite hybrid. It hasn't got one clinching thesis. It's more of an exploration of the problem of creative writing and critical writing, and some angles of approach, theoretical, philosophical, as well as, you'll see, personal. So I hope it just kind of gets you asking questions and it gives you food for thought. It's going to be quite long, I'm afraid. So, you have to bear with me. I hope to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll open up the floor. If there's anyone got any questions or comments, we can, start a discussion for 15 minutes or so.
Yes.
Great.
You can also keep your, sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Sabbagh,
no.
But you may also want to write your comments in the chat box before the end of the session, so that by the time the session ends, we'll be able to address them.
Okay, cool. And I just want to say before I start, this book, To My Mind, shameless plugging, is published in January by Whiskey Tit, and it's got about 10 years worth of some good critical writing collected in it, from reflective essays to really substantial reviews to some more scholarly, I suppose, interventions. Anyway, let's get started. I'm going to try and share screen now to go to my Word doc, if that's okay. I'll see what you see. So let's see if this works. Wait, here we go. Okay, good. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, Professor.
Okay, good. So I've titled it Only Connect, the Creativity of Critical Writing, a Semi-Philosophical Investigation, because it is only a semi-philosophical investigation. So the first part is the introduction, among some opening grumblings. And because there's a whiff of elitism suggested in this section, although I don't think I am like that personally, but there is an element of that, I have a quote here, which I love doing epigraphs. I love quotes at the beginning of sections of essays. And this is one of my favorite, from Stephen Crane, a late 19th century, early 20th century writer who died early, friend of Ford Madox Ford, who was called Hoofer at the time. And he writes, "You must not mind Hoofer, that is his way. He patronizes me, he patronizes Mr. Conrad, he patronizes Mr. James. When he goes to heaven, he will patronize God Almighty, but God Almighty will get used to it, for Hoofer is all right." Okay, bit of a comic start there. I think that's a lovely quote. I love that. Anyway, moving on. So, as it happens, I very recently came across an article by Donna Ferguson in The Observer from 21 February 21, which details how, unbeknownst to nearly everyone in his life, the renowned literary scholar and culture critic, Edward W. Said, in fact, tried his hand at writing both fiction and poetry. This article was spurred ostensibly by a recent published biography of Said, Places of a Mind, by one of his former students, Timothy Brennan, who we gather uncovers this surreptitious but abortive feature of Said's writing life for the first time. Ferguson, after Brennan's newly researched work, informs the reader that those few sallies in what is so-called creative writing were soon put aside, and that Said had come to the conclusion that the work of a critic and a public intellectual was far more important in regard to challenging power and attempting to change the world. And this conclusion was not just an early decision in his life, whose import might be seen as a reaction to a short story he'd had rejected by the New Yorker in 1965. It was a considered view, we are informed, that reached close to his death. We learned that a second aborted novel attempt, much later in his life, was also discontinued in favor of work on his memoir, Out of Place, and this in the light of what he assumed at the time was his impending death due to the fatal illness he'd suffered from for a few years by then. So this article obviously intrigued me, and not only because of the obvious fact that I'd not known that such a big, thoroughgoing critical intelligence had indeed tried his hand at creative writing, but because it recollected for me an old problematic that has fascinated me for a while now. This is the essential problem that I'm interested in. I'm not going to give answers, I'm just going to explore it in some philosophical and personal ways. So I have often wondered why so few literary critics, in my ken or without, do indeed try their hands at creative writing. By profession and experience, supposedly, they have a wide, deep fund of knowledge and insight regarding the arts of literary work. So why don't they, or at least why don't more of them, attempt to produce, say, fiction or poetry? Many do and have, of course. So a few examples here. James Wood, a renowned non-academic critic and essayist of the first caliber, has written, to my knowledge, 2 novels, one of which I've read, The Book Against God. Terry Eagleton, another huge name in literary criticism and theory, has only written 1 novel, I think, anyway, a short little tale called Saints and Scholars. Really recommend that. It's a really nice little book. I think he's written plays as well, but I'm just kind of being broad brushstroke at the moment. I have even written a paper published a few years ago in a Routledge Journal, Prose Studies, on the singular case of George Steiner, in which I tried to pressure to illuminate a similar problematic. Steiner wrote copiously, of course, throughout a long and absurdly distinguished career, one of these giants, everyone, if you don't know him. But his fictional output, which is magisterial in quality, comprises only 1 chunky volume. These few examples are of the sort that evince the problem not by no creative production among a plethora of critical work, but by significantly less of it proportionally. Umberto Eco, I think a lot of you will have heard of this name, he's a huge name, and I'm going to revisit some work of Umberto Eco a bit later, provides, along with someone like the profile like Gabriele Josipovici, just as much a hugely brilliant polyglot writer, a near parallel output between creative and critical writing, even if Eco self-professedly started his novelistic career relatively late in his writing life. Along with these 2 examples, one might add David Lodge, a prolific writer of fiction and once a prolific and distinguished academic who'd written critically to much renown. But it seems to me that these are exceptions. I don't want to enlist the converse cases, creative writers who write critically, and this primarily because it's less of a problematic, if one at all. The examples in the converse case are of such indefinite scope as to make it moot. So Nabokov writes a memoir, which involves reflection as well as narrative, Speak Memory, and so does nearly every writer of that caliber or thereabouts. Virginia Woolf and George Orwell are famed essayists. Ford Madox Ford, a novelist whose literary art intervenes crucially in the history of the modern novel, wrote much memoir and much critical writing of other sorts, from articles to weighty tomes. Anthony Burgess, say, wrote biographies and much criticism. Indeed, any reader of top-notch fiction from the 50s to the 80s of the last century will often alight on his name in the blurbs or back covers of many a pivotal novel. And I myself, for example, have written a single author study of one major contemporary poet, woman poet today, Fiona Sampson, who has now written and published, along with much else of a critical tenor, 2 major biographies of Mary Shelley and now of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So that's an example, another example. She's actually giving a talk later on the 24th on the Browning biography. In short, this relay from creative to critical is or seems to be far more automatic than the other way around. It's as if to say critical writing needs no extra skill set. Once one has the rarer, more sensitized skill set and vocation of a creative writer. At least that's what a quick quantitative assessment, more though like a general impression, but one I think that would hold water on further investigation, would indicate. So far, we are within the bounds of good sense. Now, I'm going to start with my grumbling now, like an old man. I'm not an old man, I don't think, but I am a grumbler. So it's going to be an interlude of personal grumbling now. So, given the above observations, you can see why this recent article in The Observer piqued my interest. While in a full circle move, I'll return to the case of Edward Said at the end of these introductory remarks, I want to enlist now some of my pettiness to complicate the matter before returning back to good sense again. Insofar as part of the arguments of the later part of this paper suggest that critical writing is just as personal, personally enriching, personally expressive as creative, I want now to give way to a few grumblings that seem to me nice anecdotal ways of instantiating or animating this problematic, the fraught relationship between the critical and the creative from an immediate personal standpoint. So although this paper is ultimately about, is not about critical writers who do creative writing, I just jump-starting the theme with that, along with my present grumblings, but with the ways in which critical writing is really creative. First, I want to start with some personal tiffs, annoyances though that may serve the beginnings of some enlightenment. I'll start with creative writing as seen without its due deserved weight, and then move on to the obverse case, which latter will begin to open the purpose of this paper. So guys, I'll start with creative writing. I think all of you who are creative writers may have felt this at times in a minor or a major way. So, as a creative writer myself, nowhere near renowned or distinguished, I'm often accosted by what seem to me obtuse views of creative writing. While great creative writers, be they poets or novelists, are given esteem as writers who've made valid inroads, justly, those on a track or even for a wished-for trajectory towards something like such impacts, those in the long, long distance from such, and maybe forever, like myself, are dismissed as workers of mere caprice often enough. The qualitative nature of the discipline of creative writing is often misconstrued. There is, to my mind, especially in our times, past the death of expertise, an assumption that what Coleridge, following Kant, called the constructive imagination, as differentiated from fancy, is not given the dignity it deserves, precisely because it is relegated to airy-fairy, wishy-washy fancifulness, to anything goes. Unless, of course, you are, I wish, Kazuo Ishiguro, say, or Marilyn Robinson, in which cases one has a well-nigh quantitative gauge to say important, worthwhile, or what have you. The fact that an as yet very minor writer might have much in common on a qualitative continuum with the big guns is disregarded. And it's something I like to grumble about, primarily because it's due, in my view, to a deep ignorance or misconception about the intelligence of integral creative work, be it prize-winning, best-selling or not. I will often hear phrases like, you're not a scientist, you know, or you're not making any new discovery. And I don't like facing that because I find it quite simple-minded. I think there's a lot more complexity to creative talent, as much as critical, than just a scientist versus the rest of us split. So another version of this grumbling is, you know, you've only got general knowledge, right? So the common assumption seems to be that creative writing, even if it is accorded in some vague way artfulness, is no real vocation until, well, you've made it. And thus is not worth anything or valid, only when it's only worth anything or valid post festum, by which time it's no use to people like me with aspiring ego ideals. So from this side of things, the discipline of creative writing without quantifiable status seems like nothing but a whim chosen by some that others might have chosen if they hadn't seen sense and decided to get on with more serious, impactful matters. On the other side of this acclaimed general knowledge, the accompanying assumption I notice is that a critic, or one like myself who writes with an equal critic vocation, but one who again is not famous or renowned or anything, is merely a purveyor of general knowledge until the assumption seems to mean you become a famous name, which obviously is silly. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's an assumption among people who are not engaged in creative or critical writing that unless you've already made it, you don't count. And because they're not in the medium itself, and therefore not really feeling the value of the work, even if it isn't famous or best-selling or what have you. So those are just some personal grumblings, but I think we'll see they might have more objective correlates a bit later. So even writing this paper, I imagine over my shoulder, and by the way, guys, I'm a bit paranoid at times, so maybe this is not just paranoia, not objective counterfactual imagining. I imagine over my shoulder or in the distance a voice saying flippantly, it's been done before, you know. And what is at issue for me here is not only the equal creativity of critical writing, but also the way that people who are not perhaps involved in reading or writing critical writing seem to not quite understand the nature of, I suppose, meditative, contemplative, intellectual experience. Often I'm faced with the silly notion that as a critical writer, my worth is merely a quantitative superiority of knowledge in the sense of information, garnered from merely a larger number of quantity of books read, or that critical writing is merely adding together or connecting different bits of information, different nuggets from different books, right? The idea that there might be a transformative or indeed configurative feature to critical writing and thinking is alien to many. The only connect of my title from the epigraph to E.M. Forster's Howard's End seems to me, to a lot of people, to be landing with only serious, straightforward weight on the only. Whereas for more canny readers, there is much loaded irony in that only. There is nothing only about artful creative work. There is nothing only about truly insightful, truly creative critical work. In fact, that only is an imperative, a call to arms, as we all know, I think, here. And a part of the reason it seems to me that many are eluded, many who maybe who don't practice or are not part of this scene, who are eluded by the weighty significance I give to intellectual work, is because it's a bit like a Sir Wright's paradox. So when does general knowledge become something qualitatively more than addling loads of information? Surely, like the word tall, it means nothing without some parameters against which to make the judgment. It would seem to be placed in a purely arbitrary morass, like the question, when did modernism begin? The periodicity would have to be chosen somewhat arbitrarily. Or why is a convicted rapist given 15 years imprisonment, not 14 years, 9 months, and 9 days? And so on. And the answer to this kind of arbitrariness of appellation, with the admitted absence of some notion of science and objective factuality, seems to me to be found in the texture or narrative, as we'll see, of intellectual experience, the way that felt intuitions of a critical thinker and writer become insights against the background of reading and thinking, against a progressive gestalt that gets regestalted periodically in a dynamic movement, or to be more highfalutin in a hermeneutic circle. So here's a passage which is going to seem really out there, but it'll kick in a bit later, from Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge, and I'll be maybe referring to him later. So let's see this quote I have, which I think illustrates a point quite nicely implicitly. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, British public life developed a political art and a political doctrine. The art which embodied the exercise of public liberties was naturally unspecifiable. The doctrines of political liberty were maxims of this art, which could be properly understood only by those skilled in the art. But the doctrines of political freedom spread from England to France and then throughout the world, while the unspecifiable art of exercising public liberty, being communicable only by tradition, was not transmitted with it. When the French revolutionaries acted on this doctrine, which was meaningless without a knowledge of its application and practice, Burke opposed them by a traditionalist conception of a free society. So I think what I'm trying to say there, which will kick in later, is that you can have loads of great ideas and take them as detached givens, but if you don't have the process by which they were gained, whether it's an art or a theory or a process of experimentation, you're losing actually the given that you think you have. It's part, the story behind it is part of it. So I'll expand on that a bit later, but there's a book I want to talk about a bit here by Charles Taylor, famous philosopher, contemporary philosopher from 2016 called The Language Animal. And I think some of his arguments are fascinating. They in fact tell you that any fruitful use of language, critical or creative, he doesn't actually talk about this, but it's implicit, is creative and creates newness and new realities. So you don't have to be a creative writer with the quotes on to be creating something new. And I'll explain what he says, 3 of his points in a minute. So, so it's the texture of the experience that provides the parameters by which we might gauge success or validity in non-starlet work, creative or critical. And this belongs to the sensitization process of critical reading, thinking, writing, a process of or mediation that is just as artful as that of so-called, separately called, creative writing. So here's a passage from Stefan Collini from late 90s. I always quote it because I think it's fascinating. Publication in the humanities is, therefore, not always a matter of communicating new findings or proposing a new theory. It is often the expression of the deepened understanding which some individual has acquired through much reading, discussion, reflection on a topic which has been in some senses known for many generations. Here, this prominent critic alights on the palimpsestic nature of critical discovery. Originality in this case is not some eureka moment, inventing an invention, physical or theoretical. It is often retelling old truths in new and newly telling or newly compelling clothes. Pivotally, that is to say, often this retelling turns out to be in significant ways close to absolute discovery because the process of mediation, both towards the writing and by the working texture of the very same. Or, to return to Said, what page am I on actually? Yes. So in the preface, the later preface, 1984, to his Beginnings, a book very relevant to these questions, he says, when we actually begin to write, a complex set of circumstances obtains that characterizes the beginning enterprise. In language, therefore, writing or thinking about beginning is tied to writing or thinking a beginning. A verbal beginning is consequently both a creative and a critical activity. Just as the moment one begins to use language in a disciplined way, the orthodox distinction between critical and creative thought begins to break down. This reminds me of what I teach my creative writing students from the start, that they have to begin before they know they've really begun. And they have to already be in the medium to know where they intend to go or do with the medium. Indeed, in a recent study of Said's work, Hussein speaks of Said's notion of transitive beginnings by highlighting that for Said, they, quote, take place in medias res, and the widely held belief, it must be, that's right, it's a typo, that they are otherwise, the belief that they are substantively different from or superior to what follows or flows out of them is nothing more than a necessary fiction invented by the human mind in language. And I like this notion that one's true intents, critical or creative, are in the middle of things, are in some ways, if not dramatic, dramatized or dramatizable. It seems to capture some of my own performative intents in this very writing. For me, writing, by the way, critical or creative, is a performance. So rhythm, voice, tonality are really important to me at a personal level. So to conclude the biggest section, don't worry, of this introduction, when he was late in life offered an honorary doctorate at the AUB, American University of Beirut, Said was called a Renaissance man by the president of the university. And he said that his career had been packed with intellectual explosions that only truly creative minds can trigger. And that I think is important because I think it suggests that for a critical intelligence of such magnitude to be called a creative mind is probably, in that context, therefore, a bigger compliment than just saying he was a great public intellectual. So I think it makes sense. In 1993, he gave the Reif Lectures, which are famous lectures given to prominent figures, representations of the intellectual. And it's interesting that he chose to give them those lectures on that topic, given what we said at the beginning about him saying that, you know, the work of a public intellectual and critic is more important to change than creative writing. Although we've just seen him earlier debunking that view, and I think he's still kept to that view. But then in 2017, very recently, the novelist Hilary Mantel gave the Reif Lectures. And if we add on the Collini quote, which we've just looked at, and about the palimpsestic nature of critical research and critical intellectual work, with what Said had to say in 1984 about the cohabitation of critical creative, we come out with the arithmetic with an intellectual figure like Hilary Mantel, whose highly accomplished historical novels over many decades have achieved both the re-illuminating of the past, the doing again of what was done before, but also the offering of a contemporary readership narratives of real and critical insight via the historical incisions of her consummate fictions. Mantle, in short, is not an example of a creative writer moving into critical work. She remains what she is, a novelist with a true bona fide intellectual clout. So now I've got a second section, the quote. Sorry if this is taking, well, we were already 25 minutes in. Okay, I'll try and speed up, guys, sorry. This is a quote from Terry Eagleton about fiction. The forms and techniques of fiction are autonomous of reality in the sense that if they did not stand at a distance from it, they could not carve it up, stuff up in so many ways. Fiction is a testimony to the fact the world does not force us to depict it in a single way, which is not to say that we can depict it in any old way. This comment by Terry Eagleton about the multivocal ways of fiction, but not quite infinite ways, is important for the following reason, or the way I'm going to look at it. Decades earlier, in the 60s, Frank Kermode, another famous critic, but he's passed away now, wrote a book called The Sense of an Ending, and he writes as follows. Myth operates within the diagrams of ritual, which presupposes total and adequate explanation of things as they are and were. It is a sequence of radically unchangeable gestures. Fictions are for finding things out, and they change as the needs of sense-making change. Myths are agents of stability, fictions the agents of change. Myths call for absolute, fictions for conditional assent. Myth makes sense in terms of the lost order of time. Fictions, if successful, make sense of the here and now. So both these sentiments ally with the Said transitive beginnings idea concept he developed earlier. All three register the counterfactual and polyvocal nature of intelligent writing in the modern period, the way in which fiction typifies the kind of writing there to destabilize some complacent view of a grand narrative or a fixated order of whatever sort at whatever level of analysis, individual text, life, culture, society, and so on. Said's Beginnings, actually, in 1975, was written intentionally as a riposte to Kermode's 1960s work, Sense of an Ending. However, in Hussein's already cited study, Said's philosophical take on beginning seems to match the human need or desire for a sense of ending already registered by Kermode. So for Said, reason is the stepchild of conatus. The human desire for certainty is responsible for what we call knowledge. Truth is nothing more than the will to truth, a suasive ruse of self-endowment. This Nietzschean take on things indicates that for Said, beginnings, unlike their intransitive alternates, origins, which can never be disclosed in language, are just that, choices, decisions, and ones that in all our conditionality we are driven to as much as drive. So I want to talk about how this stuff about fiction, about creative writing, nominally creative writing, can actually apply to critical writing as well. They're both, obviously, they both use language. That's trivial, obvious. But they're both not only both artifacts of language, but they both involve subjective decisions made against some sort of objective delimitations. Fiction is for Eagleton above, is nearly infinite in the way it can carve and reassemble reality, the world of experience or potential experience, but has some limits, as he indicates. So it's not anything goes. Critical writing is probably just as labile. So I chose to start this paper, by noticing the Donna Ferguson article on Said from the February 21, among another, but might have chosen from a near infinite array of other ways of beginning. But is also, critical writing is also delimited by a certain objectivity, namely the object of one's discourse, the thing you're bouncing against, right? So the novel, the poetry, the collection, or what have you. So in Heideggerian terms, we are thrown, which is to say we don't have infinite choices, only plenty and plenty of them. So now I'm going to go a bit abstract again on you. Sorry, guys, but I think some of these questions are interesting when you look at them from different angles. Umberto Eco discusses the origin of the making of signs in a similar way. He says at an abstract level, when we make use of language, we are referring to something. What is that something that induces us to produce signs? What makes us talk? And his answer is that it's what's called the dynamical object, I think in Peirce's work, but nothing important, but drives us to produce semiosis. We produce signs because there is something that demands to be said. First, there is something, the experience of being, is implicit in the first cry emitted by a baby that has just emerged from its mother's womb to greet or take account of something that manifests itself to it as the horizon, and in the baby seeking the breast with its lips. The phenomenon of primary indexicality shows us reaching out towards something, and it is irrelevant whether this something is really there or whether we posit that it is through our reaching out. It is even irrelevant whether it is we who are reaching out. There would be reaching out in any case. So this is another way of saying, in effect, that what is sets the limits to our freedom of speech. We're not gods, basically. There's always a moment before us, whether existentially or as a critic or creative writer, something that came before us. And this delimitation is seen actually not as something that's like limiting us. By limiting us, actually, it's the guarantor of the meaningfulness of our endeavors, because that being places limits on the discourse. And by being here, I mean, okay, he means stuff, anything, existence. We might mean it as a critic, a book that you're writing about. As a fiction, you might mean an experience or some research. So that being limits on the discourse through which we establish ourselves in its horizon is not the negation of hermeneutic activity. Instead, it is the condition for it. If we were to assume that everything can be said of being, if we could say anything we wanted, the adventure of continuously questioning it would no longer have any sense. It would suffice to talk about it randomly. Continuous questioning appears reasonable and human precisely because it is assumed there is a limit. So if there isn't any objective limitation to what you can do as a writer, critical or creative, then in a way, the plenty of things that you can do are not anymore plenty. So, so this is again another, this ties up with one of Said's ideas about the blindness of insight, how sometimes you can, a personal primedness, a gestalt, a way of a structure of feeling in you can be the condition of how you make progress. So, so I wanted to talk about how the condition of newness, creativity is not an infinite field, but is very much driven by the restrictions placed upon some imposed affinity. In the case of critical writing, as I said, it's what you're writing about. And we might say that, but recognizing the limits of fiction, which we normally suppose is infinite, we thereby kind of implicitly and inadvertently dignify critical writing as just as creative because it's also more naturally limited. Okay, so I want to just get some, sorry, I'm taking a long time, I apologize. There's a book by Charles Taylor from 2016, The Language Animal, which I think is wonderful. And he reconstructs a German Romantic account of the nature of language, picking up German Romantic thinkers like Humboldt, Herder, and Hamann. And he calls it the constitutive as opposed to the inframing theory of language. I want to talk about that, briefly summarize that. I think you'll find that interesting. His notion of figuring dimension of language and his consideration of the way narratives of insight produce new meanings. So for Taylor, the full shape of the linguistic capacity belongs to humans alone. Other animals use pre-linguistic signs for instrumental tasks. The use of language by the human animal by turns is a completely discrete phenomenon. So when human language, as agents, they enter a new dimension, where in effect the rightness of language use is not task rightness, instrumental, but intrinsic. Rightness, getting it right in human linguistic capacity is not just describing what's there, but transforms all aspects of the agent's life. One small example should suffice from his book. So the richer sense of world the human animal possesses due to the full shape of his or her linguistic capacity can actually enable not only the naming, but the discovery of new emotions. I think this is a really interesting common sense way of understanding it. At one level, we have an itch, say, right? And it's a feeling that we objectively have to scratch. It's independent of any self-conception or reflexivity. It's a life meaning, an objective biological call. By turns, in a different dimension, there are human meanings, which are metabiological meanings. To feel anger becomes an emotion via the way we learn through what Taylor calls joint attention or communion with our caregivers, to name it as such, and thus transform unfocused, inchoate feelings into the space of potential reasonable discourse, into the manumissions of language. So I might, on suddenly knowing that what I'm feeling, this inchoate feeling, is anger, be persuaded or persuade others to let the anger go. So we're changing reality by the vocabulary that we have. In a further remove, it's not just anger, but how does anger become indignation, where the intentionality of the emotion has an overbearing meaning or sense, a characterization, or the transformation of physical desire into love or admiration. So obviously what he's saying by these examples is that when you develop a vocabulary, either at the individual or culture or social level, you're getting deeper and newer reality happening. It's not just the preceding reality being represented retrospectively. I think that applies to all of us. And what really irritates me is when people sometimes say that, you know, having a good vocabulary is just an additive phenomenon. It is, but it's also something that deepens your life because it opens up avenues in the inside. Okay, so I'm going to just cut it short. so this is the way in which discovery and invention are two sides of the same coin. We devise an expression which allows what we are striving to encompass to appear. Okay. And the significance this thesis holds for me is that when an intelligent critical use of language is applied to what delimits it, the object of study, the new insights disclosed about the object were in a sense already there because they're based on the objective thing you're looking at. But also, while objectively there, they are truly new light or truly new facets of the target of the critical language use. So, quote, further development introduces complexity, richness, nuance. It marks distinctions which alter the shape of meanings. What was there, done before, is done once again and again and again, changing each time the purport of its whole. The second thing is about how he talks about the figuring dimension of language. He gives the example of artworks and the novel, for example. A novel as a work of art doesn't assert anything about life. It is made up of assertions, but these are about the world of the novel. Nevertheless, there emerges a non-assertive portrayal of human life, of its choices, wishes, travails, fulfillments, and this can open up new horizons for the reader. I think we all agree with that naturally. So early on, he talks about this portrayal as like the romantic notion of a symbol, which communicates a sense of things, human life, passage of time, in a way that is irreducible to literal description. So music, which I don't know much about, is the most extreme exemplar of this irreducibility, to paraphrase or précis. But even in a novel, I think, when a novel affects us, it's not just this chapter or that, this passage or that necessarily, but by the overall working in us and through us of its weave and texture, part against whole and constant revolving iteration. Okay, I mean, and I want to highlight that, when you look at something like Said's work, Beginnings, he emphasized that it was an artwork itself, not only an intellectual representation of some theses, but it was actually in itself, in its meditational structure, a work of emphatically self-expression. The final aspect of Taylor's book, which I think is really interesting, is about how when we gain insights as critical writers and critical thinkers, they actually are not really detachable or detached from the context, the background from which they emerge. So to convey an insight that one gets as a critical reader, critical thinker, critical writer, one must, quote, somehow convey the experience, the felt intuition. This throws us back into narrative. The diachronic setting of insight is not just its genesis, but its validity. So let's see what Taylor says. The story leading up to the insight is crucial to your confidence in it, not because it offers additional evidence for the insight, but because it shows that you are now in a better position to see the matter in question. The diachronic basis of the conviction can be made clear in this way. My confidence in my present insight is fed not just by the immediate force of this insight, but from my classing my previous condition, in which this insight was unachievable, as an obstacle to comprehension. An overall take on a two-stage history, before and now, is an integral part of my present conviction. Right. So I think what I might do, I want to see if I want to. So that point obviously is about how, when you have an insight, a new kind of truth in your critical thinking and writing, telling a story about how you got there is actually part of what it is, and how you feel strongly about it, and how you make other people feel strongly about it. So here's an anecdote. Many years ago, I completed an MA in philosophy, and I wrote a paper which I got a crap mark for, undeservedly. What I set myself the question was, a very basic question in ethics. If morals are absolute, if value precedes reality, given there by a God or what have you, the question becomes, why? That means that only like one society, one culture, or a series of them, perhaps, out of the whole life of social and cultural history has got it right, the rest have all got it wrong. And I think that makes it a very unpalatable idea at first. So then if you say that morals are relative, then you ask yourself this question. If everything is relative to the material, the values developed by trial and error from material exigencies on the ground, how is there radical change? Because, if I'm in spot one, what exists at that time gives me a certain value set. And how do I get from that to the next point 50 years later? So for example, if the 19th century Britain values are one set, and post-1960s Britain are very different, which they are factually, how can we philosophically grasp the change? How do we opinion, what happens? Where does the change happen? And I think narrative is key to explaining how this happens, because it happens infinitesimally. That is to say, not in one moment, black and white, but in the interstices of moments. And And that's how newness happens. And in fact, Charles Taylor gives another good example about how a word like cool from the 50s or 40s or what have you enters the new lexicon. And this would apply to our current generation of students who use the word extra. I think I've heard them use the word extra. So he says cultural newness happens. And by newness, he doesn't mean we're referring to something that existed before with a new word, but that we're creating a new reality by a new word. He says that it starts by enactment, so we feel a new reality. Then we kind of, with a few metaphorical shifts, create a new word, and then later we create discourse that justifies it. So, so he gives this really good account of how newness happens, change happens in culture via words, via concepts, via naming, but not naming a preceding reality, but naming in towards a future reality. So he says, think of moving out of the sun into the cool of the shade. Think of taking a long, cool drink there. There is a serene enjoyment beyond agitation going with the flow of things. Then someone applies the term to the music we're hearing, or someone else applies it to a proposal that we go downtown to a certain bar. At first, we may not see the point, but then you see the proposal in the music that visit to the bar can be enjoyed in the same easy movement, beyond agitation, going with the flow. There's a proposal to feel like that about a lot of things, which are not often enjoyed, or enjoyed in a quite different, more frantic spirit. The newness, so unlike, say, naming a new species of dog, which was there before us and we add a word to the lexicon referring to it, this is a new existence because it's naming a new way of being. Cool, right? Same would be with extra, I suppose, but maybe less deeply than cool, which is much more emphatic of a word. And so I think, I just want to skip a bit, sorry. So I think that this tells us something about, like with the emotions point, that developing a vocabulary as a critical thinker and critical writer, or as much as a creative writer, is creating new realities for us and those around us. Okay, finally, let me just find, okay, I want to just skip a bit. No, I think I'm going to leave the rest out, because that's a bit personal and it's not that important compared to what we might want to talk about. So I suppose, just summing up, I've used a few books of recent reading to kind of get some ideas about the artistry of critical writing as an equal and parallel way of thinking and writing as creative writing, because they use language in that way, and because, you know, vocabulary and words are not kind of extraneous or contingent features. They are things that deepen us individually, and therefore those of our readers and so on. That's a quick précis. I'm sorry if I've overdone it. If anyone wants the paper as a whole, you can email me afterwards and I'll send it to you. And then you can read it at your leisure without me rushing it or being boring. Okay. So I hope I got at least some ideas in there for people to think about, to churn, food for thought. Anyone got any comments or questions? I know some of it was abstract, but it all kind of comes to the same pattern of thinking, or nearly at least. Wait, I'm just trying to get new. Okay, stop share. How do I share? How do I stop sharing? Good.
Yes, should be up.
Hi. Sorry, guys, if I was too
Not
too
at
long
all.
there.
Dr. Sabbagh, this was a brilliant, brilliant paper. It's beautiful. It's amazing. And yes, I mean, if anyone needs a copy, not just wants a copy of it, I'll be the first one. So if there's a link to your copy, or if it's just by email, as you said.
No, just email me. I'm not
Okay.
going to be publishing it because it's not really a finished paper. It's just
So
like a
this
set of
isn't part of your
thoughts.
book. This isn't part of Kindle.
No, it's a paper I
Okay.
wrote like last month when I was preparing the talk.
Right.
And I had been reading some books and they all came together and some insights. If anyone wants the paper, just email me at sabbagh@hotmail.com. And we can engage in a dialogue. There might be some interesting quotes you might want to take and look at, or what have you. I'm not going to be publishing it, so it's up. You know, if you want it, you can just ask me.
You're not going to be publishing it.
I don't think so. Not in this state, because it's a bit too. It goes off in different directions. It's got a lot of interesting.
I thought of citing a few phrases from your essay, so now I don't have that chance anymore.
What in the where? What?
I wanted to cite a few sentences from that essay.
Oh, you can just say private. You can put a footnote saying private correspondence. People do that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay. So who would like to ask Dr. Sabbagh a question about his paper or the subject behind it?
It'll be actually useful if you have a question, because then I can sort of kind of hone my ideas a bit more than I was able to in that quick talk. Anyone got any, or just comments even?
Let me see. Let me check the chat box. Okay.
Ah, David.
David, yes.
Hi, David. He's on mute.
Oh, let me see if I can unmute.
You spoke at length on how you make insight, or how you get to insight in a critical piece is just as important as any observation you finally decide to make. So it's very personal to you. For me, when I've ever read good art criticism, it's always seemed to illuminate the aesthetic experience that I had in a verbal way that I couldn't have articulated, but that I had already felt. So what about the reader of art criticism or critical writing?
I think that's a lovely thing to say, because I think what you're saying there is that when you see that what you had felt articulated by a critic, let's say,
yes,
I don't think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I'm thinking about it is that, yes, it kind of crystallizes what you had felt, but I think once you see it articulate, it opens up a new future for you as well. Because the next time you come to an artwork, you're moving kind of a bit more spiraling outwards from that articulacy to more articulacy and more, and then deepening and deepening that way. So it's not just about representing a past feeling, it's also opening out the future for you, I think. Does that happen?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, but that's just what education is. I mean, that's what it means. Yeah.
That's why I'm saying that the critical writing is not some stodgy academic thing. It's creative. It's newness. It's it's deepening the soul. It's nothing to do with. It shouldn't be separated in some kind of separate department to creative writing. I mean, yes, it is for good practical reasons.
Yes.
But when you actually work in both, you're using the same instincts. I think a lot of the time, at least I am, and that's my experience. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And I take as much narcissistic pleasure in writing a good paper as I do in writing a good poem, and I think that tells me something psychologically, that it's rooted in the same creative instinct, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, that could be just me, though.
Yeah, I'm not a writer in this way, so I don't know, but that's how I feel when I read good criticism. That it's tapped into something that I see, but I haven't fully articulated to myself, and that's why I like good criticism. And it's very rare good criticism. It's not easy to do. I've never.
It's a very individual thing, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is that what's important is that, I mean, you teach this, I think, David. You teach style and prose.
Yes, I teach prose, but not in a not in such a big level, or not in the
but I think it's true to say that when you're teaching, in your experience, when you give them a richer vocabulary with which to work, both in the work and about the work, it's opening up new realities to them. It's not just representing something in the past. You're creating a new depth to them, which is always forward moving. And
I hope so.
Yeah. It irritates me when people say, you write poetry, and it's obviously not you guys, it's people who are already into it, who will say, well, you've got a good vocabulary, that's all. And it's not to do with actual piecemeal words. It's to do with the way you configure them and how they penetrate reality, So it's got more to it than just an additive thing,
I think so.
Just that's a personal grumble anyway. Nothing to do with any of you here, but just kind of personal. We all get it. I'm sure we all get it at different times,
We have a comment from Dr. Hedi Habra, and Dr. Habra says, great insights. Thank you so much for this interesting topic. I have always followed Mario Vargas Llosa's statement that the sort of criticism he favors is the one that involves the greatest amount of imagination.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. Because imagination is just, I said this in an article recently, imagination, as this is a famous thing that a lot of people recognize, that, when Einstein, I'm told by articles I've read, was not the best mathematician in the world, but he had an imagination that could see things differently, and therefore he had the vision. So he was a poet of physics in a way. So yeah, I think imagination is key to literally everything, as much analytical as supposedly just creative. Imagination is itself a critical tool, I think, because it's how you shape things. Yeah, this against that in a dynamic movement, and that takes a kind of imaginative capacity beyond just taking a given and breaking it down, you know.
Okay, Omar, allow me to channel my inner Jung.
Okay.
But what you just said about creating reality through words, through fiction, creativity is actually creation, you know, things of that sort. But before I go to Jung, I'm going to move a little bit back to Arthur Rimbaud. The idea of
Who? Sorry, who? Sorry.
Arthur Rimbaud.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The idea of alchemy of the word, verbal alchemy, and then moving to Jung and, you know, the whole concept of individuation and then imposing it on language. So, I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
George Steiner, the famous kind of, he's dead now, but he's the famous, you know, great man of last polymath there was with Umberto Eco probably. He had a book in the late 80s called Real Presences, in which he argued that there was a moment in the late 19th century where language began to be seen as something that creates reality rather than representing a referential given. That's true, I think, but Taylor's book, The Language Animals, does it in a much more detailed and can be very, because the whole book's about it, not just, you know, a lecture. And he does something similar, but he doesn't argue in terms of literary history. He's arguing about the actual capacity to use language for Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an argument that is, he draws on, as I say, these German romantic thinkers like Humboldt and Hamann and Herder. And he's arguing against an English empiricist tradition of Locke, Hobbes, and Condillac, who's not English, but who saw that words were piecemeal, that they added on to each other, and they represented either things preceding or ideas preceding. But there wasn't this holistic Gestalt element to it, which I think is much more the romantic way. And I think it's much more, it's truer to my experience. That's why I like the book so much. And it gave me so much to think about. Because as David said, in a way, what he's talking about happened to me when I read the Charles Taylor book. You know, he was naming things that I had felt, and now I've added it into a paper, which has created a new kind of angle of vision of things, which might lead to more things, might not, but it has the potential to deepen my thinking about many different things. And I'm sorry to everyone if some of the quotes and the discussion was very abstract, but that's the way I like to think creatively, because if you read the paper in total, when I send it to you, if you want it, you'll see that actually some of it does actually make some sense coming together. But I do think that part of the imagination of a critical thinker is that you can go enter a book, or a good book, obviously, or a book of some sort of truth to it, and you can connect it with nearly everything you've read if you have enough time. No one does that. I don't do that. But in a way, this holism is true to my experience about reading and thinking critically as much as creative. That, you know, you can go from that, it's all one, basically. That sounds really trite, but it's true for certain kinds of ways of thinking. That you can link things together in some way. I think that's what romanticism, in a way, is about. In some ways, you know, that you know, you can get an epiphany from this most contingent thing, and you know, see God. You know, not that I do that, but just that's like the hyperbole of the idea. You know, so. Pierre Menard, I love that book, the story. Yes, I love that story, Hedy. It's a very good book, but I mean, it's something about, you know, he writes the same book objectively, but it's completely different in the 20th century because of the context. It's a wonderful story that illustrates a theoretical point. But as an author myself, I would also say that it's not an infinite change. It's a 99.999% change. There has to be something also personal to the author himself. That's where I kind of, although I think it's a brilliant story and it's, you know, Borges is Borges, I don't think that context changes everything 100%. It just changes it up to 99%, but there's always a core reality. This is what Eco was talking about, that there's a core of reality to what we write, critically or creatively, that refers to something that limits us. In a way, he talks about death as well in this book, Count and the Platypus. And he says that, in effect, you know, death is a symbol of how we're limited. And that therefore, in a way, the anything goes approach to meaning actually isn't 100% right. It's plural, it's multivocal, but it's not infinite, because ultimately there is a limit. And if there wasn't a limit, like if I say to you, there are many ways of interpreting this, like, you know, the Barthes idea and death of the author, it's up to the reader and so on. So it becomes indefinite, but with the readers over time. But it's not infinite, because if it was infinite, that many would lose all meaning. It'd become chaos, it'd become nothing. Many only makes sense, even indefinite many, as long as there's some sort of ultimate theoretical limit. If it's infinite, the many loses its meaning as manyness. That makes any sense. I think that's the point he was getting at. That, you know, that as a fiction writer or even as a critical writer, he doesn't talk about them in these terms, but I think that's what he's implying. You don't have infinite scope. You have, you know, something against which you're writing always, as a critic or as a fiction writer. And that dignifies your role, I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so, Hedy. Maybe I'm neurotic as a writer, not a big writer myself. The reader owns it 99%, but that, I want to keep that 1%. I don't mean financially. I mean, like the way it's performed, the way I felt it, and you know, that's important to me. But that's probably neurotic fixation, not really truth. But
right, we have a very nice comment from Lila Tlaboha. Lila says, seeing God happens when we write because words originate in consciousness.
yes, I think, yeah. But
you know, this brings to mind one of my favorite biblical quotes, the one that starts the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. So,
well, what's interesting? But what's interesting there is that idea of the logos, which you're talking about, is a very conservative sentiment. It's saying that, you know, everything is there for a reason, right? But the point, I think the point I'm trying to make is that yes, it probably is, but as human beings, we're never going to have that totalization. So we're always grasping forwards, you know, with our understanding, with our logoi, and that we're never going to have the full rationale for everything. And if God exists, there's obviously a rationale for everything. If God doesn't exist, there probably is a rationale for everything as well. But either way, we're not going to get to it 100% because we are limited. But that limitation is the source of our creativity. If we weren't going to die, I mean, to talk symbolically, then we wouldn't. I actually think death is what forms us, makes us meaningful, and therefore, you know, in a way, when we form a sentiment, a thought in a poem or in an essay, what we're in effect doing is rehearsing our death. You know, we're giving it a limitation, a shape that closes in and then releases it. That sounds very pretentious. It is. It probably is, but it also isn't. If I had time to develop it the way I would want to, but I do think that limitation is the source of prodigality and not something that makes us less creative. You know, recognizing our limits is the source of finding our way forward and forward and forward, I think.
Perhaps it's this link between consciousness and creativity as well, although creativity can also be unconscious.
Well, let me ask you, Leela, do you find that when you write as a poet, for example, I know you're a poet, is it a combination of having an idea, an inspiration, a movement of thought, a movement of feeling, followed by the words? Or do you pen something and then follow the logic of the words? Or do you do both at the same time? And probably you do both, I would have thought. I mean, is that relevant to the sort of thing you're saying? Because I think sometimes we have intentions, but they change infinitesimally as we apply them, so that it's both from the end and from the beginning at the same time. Yeah, but wouldn't you say that when you read a perfect poem, and I don't know if I've ever read one, but probably have, that it does get it right, and that you can't fully discursively articulate in précis why it's got it right, but as it is, as an individual artifact, it's just the truth as it is. And I think that's something we all feel as artistic temperaments. You know, there's something, a realization that that's exactly what it should be, as if it existed before, but it hasn't. But the whole point being that, like music is the extreme example, I'm presuming, you can't reduce it to paraphrase. If it is the truth, then it is. Then its being is the only kind of evidence of its truth. You know, that a paraphrase will not do, even for the most brilliant paraphraser. That's also a romantic idea, I think, that you can capture the absolute in something so fine and individual But how do you gauge it? That's the problem. People have problems with that. They're like, well, it's all subjective. Of course it is a subjective, but at the same time, I don't believe that once you've lost the old idea, a classical idea of objectivity, which obviously is not true after modernism, after the symbolists and so on, that therefore it means that we have to fall into ultimate subjectivity. I think there's a process as a critical writer and a creative writer of sensitization, where you educate yourself sensually as well as conceptually, and you become part of a spectrum of the truth. It's not like one thing is true, one thing is not, but there's a kind of spectrum of truer and truer and truer and truer, which answers that question of once objectivity is gone in a scientific sense, it doesn't have to be just I take a crap on the floor and look at it in the right way and it's an art. That's not true for me. That's completely not true. Yeah. I'm not saying that people do that. I mean, I know there's a lot of good discourse about a lot of the modern contemporary art, but I'm saying that the ultimate extreme of it is just wrong. It's just not true. Art, if it means something that's delimited by something, form, intention, death, whatever, but there is a limit. It can't be just chaos. I don't think so anyway. Sorry if I've gone off on like 15,000 different tangents, but that's what I do.
You can see the other comments, Alma, right?
I can't see them. Let me see them.
Okay, so I'll read to you. There's a comment by Pulkit Chopra. Pulkit says, "Thank you so much, Professor, for making me realize that limitation is an asset." Exactly.
Thank you, Pulkit. I'm glad. It does. Self-limitation actually leads to leaping over your limitations. And it's the most intelligent and responsible way to do so. Because when you realize what your limits are, then you know how to improve yourself. But if you think you're God, if anyone does implicitly or, not necessarily literally, you end up, going backwards, not forwards, So I do think that's important to know your limitations or to recognize any limitations and use them as an asset, as you say, Pulkit. You yourself have written some wonderful essays in my course. I'm glad you attended, Pulkit. Thank you very much.
We also have another comment by Lila. Using a very simple lexicon, although I believe it is beneficial to widen our vocabulary too, in a way the writer or poet disappears when they write.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your aesthetic. There are writers who are, self-expressive and they're like in your face. And there are more classically, like I was giving an example. I just got the latest book by Kazuo Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun. If you read his prose, I mean, the guy is obviously a genius. He's won the Nobel Prize. But you read his prose, I mean, there's not one sense of, obviously the conception is original and there, but his prose doesn't get in the way of any kind of character or reality or concept. It's just completely translucent. Whereas people like me who are very wordy and love words and luxuriate in them end up getting refused by publishers because I love words too much that it gets in the way of people really getting to the plot or whatever, or what have you. But I think it's just different temperaments. I mean, it's not like I don't know I'm verbose when I write, for example. I just love it. It's how I work. So until someone gets it, tough. I'm not going to try and write in a way which makes me disappear. Although I do think, Lila, you're right. Some of the best writing does actually make the author disappear. So in a way, I'm hindered by verbosity in that sense. There is some fantastic writing, which is clear, which is so clear and translucent that you feel like it wasn't written by a groping, striving author, but it was just there, because it captures the cleanliness of a truth, But I think it's just different temperaments. There are writers who write, verbosely and mannered and baroque, and there are others who write in a kind of more self-effacing way. The self-effacing way is actually the more, I think anyway, the more prosperous, the more praised. But I wouldn't. I mean, there's a recent critic I've read about called, I think his name is Michael Marr, German critic. He's, I think, based in Stanford. He's got a book, which I've only read an excerpt of. It hasn't been translated from German yet, so I can't read it. But I think what he's doing there is he's going against the whole dogma in creative writing, the Hemingway dogma about concision, losing out epithets, adjectives, adverbs. And he's pointing out that some of the greatest writers in the late 20th century, use adjectives and adverbs, but they weren't getting in the way. They were constellating, they were making it richer. Obviously, there's a truth to the whole, keep your sentence short, spare, and so on. That's very true to narrative, especially because you get more plot and drama in. But I don't think you can just throw the baby out with the baby bathwater. When I read this book, it's going to be a joy because he's going to celebrate authors who do use luxurious epithets and do it well, you know? So it's kind of a timely book, I think. I mean, it's a personal thing. That is a personal thing, whether how you use language. It's to do with your way of, the way your mind works. Like you said, Lina, consciousness, how your mind is rigged and how it latches onto words. We all have different different paths, different experiences. So we relate to the language differently, I suppose.
Right. Lynn Nasser says, thanks, Professor, for the incredible session.
Thanks, Lini.
Diana Sabbagh says, thank you for an interesting lecture.
Cheers, sis.
And Polkit thanks you again.
Ah, good. So guys, if any of you want the lecture as an email to read it at your leisure, just send it to me. Send me an email. It's Sabbagh, SABBAGHO @hotmail.com. I'd be glad to share it with you because it would make me feel better. Like I felt like I didn't fully deliver as it should have been delivered, but if I feel like you've got it, then you can kind of enjoy it in your own time, if you want to.
I just posted your email address in the chat box area.
No, that only goes to the people here, not to the whole internet world, right?
Yeah, it shouldn't be.
Okay, one more thing, guys, just in case anyone's interested. To My Mind or Kim Boat's Essays on Literature, pretentious title, but still very good book, I think. Some good critical essays in there, ranging from kind of scholarly essays to good reviews, like substantial reviews of substantial authors, to the odd reflective essay. If you're interested in critical writing, you know, look it up. Why not?
Great. Thank you so much for a brilliant lecture, Dr. Sabbagh. And I just want to also invite everyone to hear Dr. Sabbagh reciting some poetry again on the 31st. So Dr. Sabbagh will be reading some poems with Professor Fiona Sampson, Anthony Anaxagoro. So this will be the grand finale for our festival, and it'll also be at 6 p.m. Dubai time, just like this session, on the 31st of March. And again, as Dr. Sabbagh said, Professor Fiona Sampson will be with us on the 24th at 6 p.m. Dubai time too. So thank you once again. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Dr. Sabbagh. And
thanks, everyone.
We hope to see you all again soon in some more festival sessions. So we still have the rest of this week and next week up until the 31st.
Well, thanks everyone for bearing with me.
It was a great session. Thank you so much.
It was fun. Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Polkit. Bye.